few years back when I was visiting Rome with a group of pilgrims, one of the places that we visited was the catacombs. The catacombs in Rome are these deep underground tunnels, usually under the modern buildings of Rome or under an old convent or monastery, like the ones we visited at the Benedictine Sisters of St. Priscilla. They're fascinating places that narrate ancient Roman customs and traditions with Christian images painted on the walls. And one of the most prominent images is the depiction of Christ as a young beardless shepherd holding a sheep on his shoulders. And this very ancient theme of early Christian art is expressed today in the gospel, where Christ took pity on the crowd who were like sheep without a shepherd. The setting of today's gospel takes place when the apostles are returning from their first missionary experience, when 2 by 2 they went off to preach the message of God's love. And they come back tired and in need of rest. And the Lord understands that, and he says to them, come on, let's get away from the crowd and go to a secluded place. But we know that the story tells us that the crowd followed, and the Lord realized that they really needed the Lord at that time. And what he says is that his heart was moved with pity because they were like sheep without a shepherd. Sheep without a shepherd. 200 years ago in South Boston, where I am now pastor, there was a similar situation. The early Catholic settlers in Boston were like sheep without a shepherd. There was a handful of priests covering the Catholic population of most of New England. Most of the early Catholic settlers of New England were from Ireland and from Italy and other European countries. But all of them needed and wanted to have the freedom to worship as a Catholic in their own church. In Boston, 200 years ago, it was not easy for the early Catholic pilgrims and immigrants. They faced discrimination and oppression as they arrived on the shores of the East Coast. But there were 2 missionary priests from France who arrived in Boston in the late 1700s. There was a Father Matignon and a Father Chevreuse. Father Chevreuse would later become the first bishop of the Diocese of Boston. And in those early days, the diocese was geographically the entire landmass of New England, the current New England. It was missionary territory. Father Matignon and Father Chevreuse were persistent as they established the Catholic Church in the Northeast. And they built the first Catholic church in New England, a small church building in the center of the city of Boston, called the Church of the Holy Cross, which was later moved to its current location. The second church building that Bishop Chevreuse built in the city of Boston was a place called St. Augustine Chapel, and that's where I am pastor of. And we celebrate this year at St. Augustine Chapel 200 years of its existence. Cardinal Sean O'Malley will celebrate a Mass this September commemorating 200 years of its existence and its historical importance for the early church in the United States. It's the oldest Catholic church in Massachusetts and the second oldest Catholic church in all of New England. And it's also considered by architects as the oldest surviving Gothic revival church in Massachusetts. And if you've ever visited St. Augustine Chapel, it's surrounded by an historic cemetery. And the chapel was first built as a mortuary chapel that Bishop Chevreuse built for his helpmate, Father Matignon. A few years later, it was enlarged to accommodate the hundreds of immigrants that were settling in South Boston. Now, the historic nature of the building and the cemetery grounds is important, yes, just like most of our older churches. But more importantly, I think, St. Augustine Chapel and Cemetery represents the first connection to the first missionary priest, Father Matignon, who is considered the founder of the Catholic Church in Boston. He came to minister as today's gospel proclaims, to minister to the sheep who were without a shepherd. He ministered with great zeal, faith, conviction, and determination to provide for the early Catholic settlers the real presence of Christ in word and in sacrament. And the chapel and cemetery represent also the great struggles and sacrifices that our ancestors in faith endured in practicing their faith in the midst of discrimination and hardship. If you wander through the cemetery, you will see the stories of these gravestones, stories of the early Irish immigrants, where they came from, the ages who died from little infants to those in their 80s. It tells the story of those who came before us, whose descendants would go on to build the Catholic Church community throughout New England and beyond. Today, I think we need to be reminded of our history, of how much our ancestors sacrificed for us. We forget sometimes the simple faith that sustained our great-grandparents and great-great-grandparents. We so take for granted our faith today sometimes that our churches and our faith communities are no longer a priority. As Jesus instructs us in today's gospel, we need to find a quiet place, a deserted place, a place where we can truly listen to the Lord, speaking to our hearts and minds about who we are as Catholic Christians, where we came from, and where we are going. As I celebrate this year 200 years of Catholic history in Boston at St. Augustine Chapel and Cemetery, I'll be thinking and praying about the significance of my Catholic faith and how I can bring it to Christ, how I can bring Christ to others. I hope you will too.